Welcome back, Biology 182 Lab students. Today we'll be discussing Labs 28 and 29, which cover the kingdom Plantae, and we have 4 phyla we're going to be going over. The seedless non-vascular plant phyla we'll be looking at today are the phylum Bryophyta and the phylum Hepaticophyta. And then the seedless vascular plants are phyla Pterophyta and Lycophyta. You can find these on page 299 and 309 in your lab text, respectively. So some of these plants you might be familiar with. Mosses we find near streams in Flagstaff and Sedona. Liverworts. Ferns we find quite commonly in our ponderosa forest here. Horsetails we can find around streams and lakes. And club mosses. Let's examine a cladogram or phylogenetic tree of our kingdom Plantae. We begin with Plantae evolving from a green algae, a chlorophyta, down in the bottom left-hand portion of our diagram. So as we work our way through time, we can see that algae still exist, and we have simple and complex chlorophytans. And then we have the origin of land plants. So we're moving from the ocean to land somewhere around 500 million years ago. Then we have our liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, and those are under the Bryophytes, and those still exist today. And then as we work our way up, we have an extinct group called the Protracheophytes, and they're not quite vascular, but then we have vascular plants that use vessels to transport nutrients throughout the body. And those are the Leucophytes, and then the ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns. As we work our way over, we can see gymnosperms and angiosperms, which we'll be discussing later. So today we can find liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. Those are in Bryophytes. Pteridophytes are the Ferns Allies. So ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns. And the Leucophytes, which are club mosses. A little bit different than regular mosses. An introduction to the kingdom Plantae. Let's look at some ancestral traits. Those are shared with green algae from which plants evolved around 450 million years ago. 1, they're eukaryotic. So again, they're going to have membrane-bound nucleus and they're going to have organelles. 2, they're autotrophic. So they're going to have some sort of pigment like chlorophylls to be able to collect sunlight, photons, and make sugars. 3, then we store that sugar in the form of starch and cellulose walls. Cellulose is actually a complex sugar, and so the plants can make cellulose from sugar. We have alternation of generations, just like we saw in our algae and in our fungus, and we have asexual and sexual reproduction. The derived traits of plants that adapt to life on land, so they stand upright and they don't dry out. So they have many adaptations to avoid desiccation. They have a protected embryo. So the internal fertilization is followed by a zygote that grows into an embryo protected by the parent. They have a waxy cuticle. So this is a lot of times made out of oils and waxes, and it's a layer that holds in moisture, but allows gas exchange through pores or stomata. And then they have jacketed sex organs. So the gametes are protected during development in the female, which is called archegonia, and the male, antheridia, sex organs. Our Lab 28 is on the Bryophytes. These are non-vascular spore plants, so they do not contain vessels. Your objectives for your test. Number 1, what is their ecological and economic importance? 2, what occurs in their alternation of generations life cycle? 3, what structures and processes are involved in sexual and asexual reproduction? 4, how are mosses and liverworts distinguished? And 5, what is the purpose of the sporophyte and gametophyte? And what do these life stages look like? So here's some examples of some bryophytes. Down the bottom left we have a lanky moss, and we have a liverwort, And then in the bottom right, we have a big red stem moss. In summary, bryophytes are a group of small ancient plants, mosses and liverworts, that are the ancestors of all modern land plants and mark the transition from aquatic to terrestrial life cycle. Sex is dependent on a moist environment, and yet most plants can survive dormant, without water for days to years depending on the species. Their complex alternation of generations for their life cycle includes a dormant leafy gametophyte that produces sex organs and a short-lived sporophyte stage that produces spores in capsules. These spores are by all means of dispersing offspring, which is aided by the wind and sometimes water. Bryophytes excel at asexual reproduction, and many rely as this is their main form of dispersal and reproduction, as it requires little to no water and much less energy. Bryophytes are an integral component of every terrestrial and freshwater ecosystem and provide many ecosystem services such as soil stabilization, water retention, nutrient recycling, carbon storage, and offering protected habitat to microorganisms. What are the ecological roles of bryophytes? Well, one, they contribute substantially to biodiversity in all terrestrial ecosystems, including Antarctica. There's about 24,000 species worldwide. Two, they have a lot of carbon storage ability, especially in bogs and peatlands in the Arctic and Antarctic. Three, they really are good at succession, so they can colonize rocks and create soil, allowing seedlings from other plants to establish. We are familiar with them from a distance, green fluff on everything. In Arizona, we don't recognize them because they're not green. We can watch a moss rehydrate in the lab. It turns green again. We have some pictures of some different mosses. We have temperate rainforest mosses in the bottom left. We have dry forests, and deserts have mosses too. They're just a little bit different than what we're used to. Antarctic mosses off to the bottom right. And then we have some mosses with some sort of other species of plant growing out of them. What other ecological roles do bryophytes play? Well, they provide microhabitats to a bunch of organisms like spiders, mites, worms, insects, protists, nematodes, water bears. And these microinvertebrates live, lay eggs, reproduce, and swim through the waters of the bryophytes. A factoid, mosses survive in the desert by going dormant. Many can survive asleep for years, some as long as 100. In the right-hand side of things, they form soil crusts. So we can see crust communities with algae, lichen, moss, and bacteria, like cryptobiotic crusts, commonly found throughout the Colorado Plateau. They can stabilize soil. These cryptobiotic crusts can hold in soil and allow for other plants to colonize. Otherwise, the sand would just move around in the Colorado Plateau. That reduces erosion, and then that also allows nitrogen-fixing bacteria to have a home. So they can now start producing nitrogen compounds that are used by other organisms and changing a desert landscape to more of a productive landscape. And then they also provide habitat for microorganisms, as we mentioned before. What are the economic uses of bryophytes? Well, peat moss is a really big one. A lot of people burn peat moss for heating their homes. It can be used in the production of Scotch whiskey, so it distills quite nicely with a very particular taste. It's added to potting soil for water holding capacity, so a lot of times people that have a lot of plants, especially potted plants, they'll put a lot of peat moss surrounding the top, which prevents the soil from desiccating. Of course, it can be used for wound dressing. We saw that in both world wars. It can still be used today in the wild. And five, the future. So we got a problem with mosses. They resist fungal infection and survive frost. So they may provide valuable genes for genetically modifying our crops. Here's some examples. We have a sphagnum moss that's found in a bog in Maine. You can see some sporophytes there coming out of the gametophyte. In the bottom left, we see a sphagnum hummock which a hummock is kind of like a lump of moss that's a small hill of moss found throughout a peat bog. And then we can see a picture of that peatland ecosystem, so it's critical habitat. A lot of fish survive around, a lot of insects, a lot of caribou spend a lot of time around peat. It's a big sink for carbon storage, so these guys can take carbon from the air, CO2 from the air, and sequester it. And it covers 3% of the Earth, especially around the Antarctic and Arctic circles. The alternation of generations life cycle seen in all plants. There's a gametophyte generation, and that's the top portion of our diagram here. It's in that light tan color. The sporophyte generation is in the purple and below. The gametophyte, that's the life stage producing gametes. So they produce eggs and sperm via what? Mitosis or meiosis? You gotta think about that one. Then there's a sporophyte part where the life stage is producing spores, which are always haploid to disperse offspring. And is that one meiosis or mitosis? Then we have something called syngamy, which is the union of gametes. It's kind of like fertilization, so nuclei fuse to create a diploid zygote, the first cell in the sporophyte stage. And then there's something called a sporangia, that's a spore-producing organ on the sporophyte plant. The alternation of generations life cycle in bryophytes is simultaneously and attached. So we have a diploid stage, and it's ephemeral, meaning it doesn't last very long. That's called the sporophyte. The gametophyte stage is the dominant one that we're used to in mosses. So take a look at the difference. We see the leafy-like structures on the haploid stage, the gametophyte, and we see non-leafy-like structures on the diploid stage. I want you to ask yourself, what type of cells would the gametophyte produce via mitosis? Gametes, hence the name gametophyte. Then those unite and make the sporophyte. So what type of cells would be produced by the sporophyte? Spores. Understand? The phylum Hepaticophyta, or the liverworts, the gametophyte is dominant. And the leafy stage that we see is called the thallus, somewhat like our algae. They're bilaterally symmetrical, meaning we can cut them into equal left and right halves. They produce male and female stalks bearing the sex organs. We'll see that on the next slide. Take a look off to the right. We see the thallus that is bilaterally symmetrical, and they have huge air chamber with one pore each. Now the next thing is they have a sporophyte. It's a tiny sporophyte. It emerges on the bottom side of the female archegoniophore. They have sexual reproduction, and they need water for fertilization. And something interesting about them, they have these asexual reproduction with gemicups, seen off to the right. They're filled with asexual propagules or clones that will be splashed to new locations via raindrops. And they can also be fragmented to begin new organisms from asexual reproduction. Let's take a look at the two sexual reproducing structures in liverworts. We have an archegoniophore. That's a female reproductive structure yielding archegonium that in turn yields eggs. Notice how that it's kind of flipped upside down. So we have the eggs on the bottom coming from the archegonium, from the archegoniophore. The antheridiophore is the male part. It's the male reproductive structure yielding antheridium that in turn yields sperm. So we can see a picture of these in the bottom left, we can see that yellow sporophyte capsule releasing spores after it's been fertilized. And then in the bottom right-hand picture, we can see antheridiaphores. So notice they look different. The archegoniaphore kind of looks like a palm tree, and the antheridiaphore looks more like a fungus type object. Let's take a look at the liverwort life cycle. Off to the left, we can see two distinct colors. Again, the light purple is the sporophyte generation, and the gametophyte is the tan color. So, first off, number one, the male gametophyte produces and releases sperm from the antheridiaphores. Two, the female gametophyte produces eggs in archegoniaphores. Three, the sperm swims to and fertilized egg, producing a zygote. So these things need water to be able to reproduce, and that's why we find liverworts typically in wetter environments. 4, the zygote grows into a tiny sporophyte, which emerges from the bottom side of the archegoniaphore we call the umbrella. And 5, the spores are produced via meiosis inside a structure called the capsule. And then 6, the spores are dispersed via wind and sometimes water. The phylum Anthocerophyta, which are the hornworts, we only find one species that lives in Arizona. They're the smallest phylum of Bryophytes, with only 100 species described. The sporophyte is a horn that splits vertically to release spores. The gametophyte is a tiny flat thallus, usually about 2 or 3 centimeters long. They aid in nitrogen fixation via supporting symbiotic cyanobacteria on the thalli. Let's take a look at that horn, that sporophyte, down in the bottom left-hand diagram. So it splits vertically. So we can see the columella that's poking out. We see the spores that are coming out. We see that it has stoma, and on the inside of that column we can see something called a pseudolater. And then we have sporogenous cells. So those are going to be going through meiosis. We have a later initial cell, the columella, the meristem, and the foot. Now that foot is what goes into the gametophyte. We can see the gametophyte plant is that leaf-like structure that has rhizoids on the bottom, and it produces the antheridium and the archegonium, which produce an egg and sperm. And then once they unite, then they will create another horn. We can see a picture of the sporophyte in the middle picture, and the gametophyte on the bottom. And then the bottom right is a bunch of those horns growing together. Phylum Bryophyta, which are the true mosses, they have a gametophyte dominant stage. The leaves are arranged radially. The thin leaves with no effective cuticle, so they lose or gain water rapidly. They have a sponge effect, so water and nutrients move passively through their cells. They don't have roots, but rhizoids anchor them, and they must remain tiny, usually less than 8 inches tall. That's because they don't have vascular tissue to transport things to their cells. So they require many of their cells to be exposed to the environment to be able to absorb nutrients and get rid of wastes. The sporophyte generation is short-lived. We have an interesting structure that has a stalk with capsules at the top. The spores are produced in the capsule, and it's dependent on the gametophyte for energy. So without the gametophyte, the sporophyte doesn't happen. Asexual reproduction for mosses, any part of the gametophyte can reproduce a whole new clonal moss via fragmentation. In the bottom right-hand diagram, we can see that capsule that's in the sporophyte generation, the seta, and then the foot that's anchored into the gametophyte, which is anchored by rhizoids. The sexual reproduction in bryophytes, we have the gametophyte stage, which is the gamete plant produces the multicellular sex organs. So we have antheridia, which are sac-shaped, and they have motile flagellate sperm. The sperm require water to swim to the eggs in the archegonia, which is the female organ. It's flask-shaped. It has one non-motile egg per archegonium. It protects the developing embryo after fertilization. And then the sporophyte stage, comes out, and it's the diploid product of sex and eventually produces spores via meiosis. So we can see off to the right, we have that antheridia with a moss stem tip with red antheridia that are stained red. In the bottom right, we see the archegonia. It's flask-shaped, and it has that one non-motile egg in the middle of that archegonium. Looking further at the sporophyte, capsule, and seta, number one, inside a moss capsule, meiosis produce haploid spores. Two, the capsules have a hat that pops off when the spores are mature. The teeth around the capsule bend outward, helping to disperse spores. The seta, or stalk, elevates the capsule to aid in wind dispersal of the spores. And the spores are offspring, and they will become new moss, the gametophyte generation. In the bottom left, we can see that picture again of the seta and the capsule. If we look at the capsule closely in the bottom middle picture, we can see green spores are ready to be released. And then the teeth help project spores further into the wind, getting away from something we call the boundary effect in fluid mechanics, which we'll be discussing later a little bit with the animals. The alternation of generations life cycle for mosses are, let's take a look at our diagram first so we know where diploid and haploid are. Diploid is at the top, above the line, and below the line is haploid. Number one, the leafy gametophyte produces male and female sex organs and gametes. 2, after it rains, sperm swim to the egg. 3, diploid zygote is formed, the first cell of the sporophyte stage. 4, the mature sporophyte, the seta and capsule, rise above the gametophyte and produce spores via meiosis. 5, once the spores are matured, the lid, or operculum, pops off. 6, the spores are dispersed via wind. And 7, a spore grows into a new leafy gametophyte. In Chapter 29, we have the Vascular Spore Plants, which are ferns and fern allies. Your objectives for your test are: number 1, what traits distinguish vascular spore plants from bryophytes, the non-vascular spore plants? 2, discuss similarities and differences between phyla, Pterophyta, and Lycophyta. 3, what does the alternation of generations entail in these plants? And 4, how does alternation of generation differ from that of bryophytes? Bottom left-hand picture, we can see a familiar fern frond. The next to that, we can see a whisk fern. Next to that, we can see a horsetail. And then in the bottom right, we can see a club fern, which some of these you might be familiar with, some of these you might not be. In summary, vascular spore plants are a group of seedless plants that use spores to disperse their offspring through their often moist habitats. Their dormant sporophyte stage can grow much taller than the dominant stage of the bryophytes, the gametophyte. This is thanks to their vascular systems and lignin tissue, which allows them to move water and nutrients up against the force of gravity. Their gametophytes are small and relatively short-lived, rarely seen in nature. Asexual reproduction often prevails because it requires much less water and energy. Although not eaten by many animals, these plants provide habitat for many microorganisms, both on their leaf surfaces and beneath their low-lying, shaded canopies. The evolutionary adaptation in vascular plants, obviously, is number 1, a solid vascular system. Take a look at this tree fern in Malaysia. Tree ferns can get quite tall. It was the development and evolution of the vascular plant that allowed for plants to really rise toward the sun and make a multi-level canopy. When plants first invaded terrestrial ecosystems, it was mostly ground-dwelling, small-leafed plants that were non-vascular. But then a vascular system really allows for transport of nutrients far away from the soil. I want you to think along these lines in mechanical engineering when we talk about evolution in this class. Nature goes with what works. There are certain forms of mechanical devices that work really well. Humans know this because when we transport water around, you don't see trucks delivering water directly to a school or a home. It's transferred via pipes. It's much easier. Same thing with gas and electricity. So that is how these organisms work, the same way. They go with what works. 2, they have stomata. Stomata are small openings on the leaves or fronds of plants that can open or close. And they release water, being a byproduct of photosynthesis, but in times when water is not available, those stomata can be closed. And the sporophyte is dominant in vascular plants, much different than the gametophyte as we saw in non-vascular plants. Let's examine this vascular system in detail. So we see these vascular plants, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. The vascular tissue is a pipe-like vessel made of cells that are end-to-end. We have 2 different kinds of vascular tissue. We have xylem, and that's tissue that transports water and nutrients up, and phloem. The tissue transports products of photosynthesis primarily down, but can also transport up. Because don't forget, autotrophic cells also do respire. They do need sugar to run off of. In many cases, the cells just use the sugar that's available. But there are many cells that are not autotrophic, such as in the bark, that need to be fed by the autotrophic cells. Let's get into the biomechanics of how vascular plants transport water, nutrients, sugar. So xylem transport typically has water in it, also a few different ions, such as dissolved minerals. They enter the plant through the root hairs and they travel up. How they travel up is when the stomata are open at the top of the plant in the photosynthetic cells. Basically the water is broken apart into gases. And when it's broken apart, then it's able to leave the cell via diffusion. Now, this requires the xylem to never be broken. So the way water works is it has this very unique property called cohesion, which means if there's a string of water molecules all in series, they stick together with quite a lot of force, and it requires something like megapascals or gigapascals to pull it apart. And plants can transport millions of gallons in their lifetime this way. The phloem transport, these are dissolved sugars, and these are produced in leaves, and they are stored as starch or as cellulose. They travel to growing cells for energy use and in cellular respiration, not forgetting that plant cells also have mitochondria, and there are many cells that are not photosynthetic, especially in the roots. Vascular plants breathe with stomata. What is a stomata? It is an opening on the leaves. So vascular plants prevent desiccation with their waxy cuticle, but they need to breathe. They need to take in carbon dioxide, so they have pores on their leaves. The stomata, singular stoma, have 2 guard cells on the outside, and then the pore in the middle. These guard cells open and close the pore to regulate water loss. How they open and close is by filling vacuoles with water or draining water out. So they're hydraulically operated. And the way that this works is a plant can open and close their stomata based on environmental conditions. So if a plant is becoming water stressed, generally it will close its stomata. But what's the problem with that? Well, then they can't breathe. So there has to be some way of still being able to draw on that carbon dioxide. Here's a question for you. On a hot, dry afternoon, so we're going to probably see stoma close. But on a humid day, they'll stay open. What are the pros and cons to having stomata? The benefits are they allow gas exchange. CO2 enters for photosynthesis and water and oxygen exit. Transpiration, so water evaporating out of the stoma pulls water up from the soil. There's a nice video on transpiration there. And they can respond to the environment. So they can close when they're flaccid and they open when they're turgid. It's a little opposite than what most people think. The cost is the plants can die from losing too much water. but they have to open sometimes for gas exchange. So there's a balance between opening and losing water. Gas exchange is required for photosynthesis. In leaves, CO2 is taken through stomata. You should have had this in Biology 181 in your lecture and laboratory. And then 2, photosynthesis uses carbon and water to make organic sugars. 3, sugars move to the rest of the plant via the phloem. And 4, the byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, and again, remembering water. And 5, leaves release water and O2 through the stomata. So we can see off to our left, our big diagram, we can see light coming in. We have on the bottom of our leaf, we have those stomata and guard cells. At the top, we have a cuticle and no stoma. And then we can see there's epidermis, there's mesophyll cells, and then we can see we have the xylem that's bringing in water, and then water is split during photosynthesis, and then those gases escape out of that mesophyll in the palisade parenchyma, and then leave the cuticle by those open stomata. The differences in alternation of generation life cycle between bryophytes and ferns and fern allies are: 1, the dominant stages vary. So we can see off to our left we have a bryophyte, and off to our right we have a fern. In the left, the sporophyte dependent on the gametophyte in mosses, as we remember. If we look off to our right, though, we can see our fern. We have the sporophyte, and the gametophyte are 2 separate individuals. So the large sporophyte and the small independent gametophyte, whereas the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte in mosses. The relationship between the 2 life stages varies. There's independent versus dependent. And then the spores are produced in different structures. So we can see capsules seen in mosses, but we also see some types of capsules in some ferns. There's also something called sori, or sorus is singular, which form on the bottom of the leaf, and then sporangia that come from those sori. What are some of the traits of the vascular spore plants, ferns and allies? Well, they have a sporophyte generation as dominant, and they have an independent gametophyte, unlike the mosses. The gametophyte stage is ephemeral, meaning it doesn't last for very long. And it's a tiny heart-shaped thallus. The sex, they have to have water to be able to do this, so they have motile sperm that needs a film of water to swim to the eggs. The vascular system transport water or nutrients up against gravity, and that makes plants that can grow taller. They also need some sort of structural support to be able to do this, so they have a very specific type of tissue called lignin that enables vertical growth and protects the vascular tissue. As we combine a lignin and cellulose together, that makes something that we're all familiar with, is wood. And wood is quite a strong structure for even very large trees that are 100 meters tall to grow. The phylum Pterophyta, which are the true ferns, we find them in moist habitats, but some grow epiphytically and in deserts. The sporophyte stage is the dominant stage, and fronds divided into leaflets we call pinnae. The reproduction, we can have asexual with rhizomes, so those are below ground stems, and little water is required. But sexual, we have sperm that swim to eggs on the gametophyte called the prothallium. The spores are produced in sori, singular as sorus, on the underside of the fronds. We can see a few different pictures here. In the top right, we can see a whole fern. In the middle picture, we can see a leaf with sori, typically found on the underside of the fronds. And then we see a fern sporophyte stage is leafy and produces spores. So we see that heart-shaped thallus, and that produces archegonium and antheridium. And then those produce egg and sperm, and then of course those unite and make a sporophyte that grows into the fern that we're used to. Included in the phylum Pterophyta are the whisk ferns. We find these in moist woodlands or riparian areas. Riparian meaning a lot of water is around. Sporophyte stage, they're broom-like morphology, so they lack roots, they lack leaves, and the green stems photosynthesize. So they kind of look like a whisk used in cooking. The spores are produced in lobed sporangia, not sori, on the stems. And they're homosporous, so all the spores look the same. Heterosporous, you can guess, is when there are two different spores that are made. And the gametophyte resembles that of ferns. So the dominant sporophyte stage with yellow lobed sporangia that'll be producing spores. Included in the phylum Pterophyta are horsetails. The habitat, we find them in moist woodlands or riparian areas, again around lakes, rivers. The sporophyte stage is jointed and has ribbed stems, and stomata are in those ribs. And they can have little tiny black leaves that are around the joints, and they're vestigial, meaning they don't do any photosynthesis. It's the green stems that actually do the photosynthesis. Then we have some spores that are produced in a strobolus, or cone, that's found atop the stem. The sporophylls compose the strobolus and hold the sporangia. So we can see a little bit of the anatomy of what we're talking there under the right. See the joint, the stem, those little vestigial leaves that are black, and the end of the sporophylls that are on the strobolus. A factoid, so the silica-rich stems that resist insect predators were used to scrub pots and pans and polish metal by Western settlers, kind of like diatomaceous soil. In the new phylum Lycophyta, we find the club mosses. Their habitat, we find them in moist woodlands or shaded slopes and dry woodlands. An interesting fact, these tree-sized lycophytes dominated the swamp forest during the Carboniferous period, about 350 million years ago, and that made coal. So most of the coal that gives us electricity that are in the classroom or at home powering your computer to watch this came from giant club mosses in ancient swamp forests. The sporophyte stage, there's a small pine tree-like plants with needle-like leaves that are called microphylls, arranged spirally around stems. You can see a little bit of that off to the bottom right. You can see those little tiny sporophyte stages with those leaves that spirally go around. And then to the left of that we see the strobili, or cones, and that's where spores are produced at those branch tips. Taking a look at our diagram, we can see off to the right is our prothallus, which is haploid, and then off to the left is our familiar fern that is diploid. So this is how it works. The gametophyte prothallus produces sex organs and their gametes. We see that usually on the underside of the enlarged prothallus, which is heart-shaped in ferns. And then they have that antheridium that produce sperm and the archegonium that produce an egg. The motile sperm swims to the egg on another prothallus. And how the prothallus and the gametophyte actually prevents self-fertilization is by opening the antheridium and archegonium at different times. So then, once they're united, and then we have a diploid zygote that grows into the leafy sporophyte, which we're used to, which produces spores in sori, which are clusters of sporangia. Then these spores disperse offspring which grow into new gametophytes.